There's a strange thing about fate. Sometimes it places the richest man in the world in exactly the same place as the poorest. Sterling Blackwood had it all, literally everything. A Manhattan penthouse, a private jet, a bank account with more zeros than most people can count. But when that Gulfstream G650 plummeted from the sky one stormy night, all those zeros meant absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, across town, Jack Morrison slept under a bridge with only a battered army backpack and the scars of a war no one remembered. Two men, two worlds, one night that would change everything. The irony is brutal. Sterling spent his entire life building empires, closing billion-dollar deals, commanding boardrooms like a general. Jack, he commanded real platoons in Afghanistan, saved lives under enemy fire, came home with medals that didn't pay the rent. One built fortunes, the other built cardboard shelters. But when the fuselage of that jet split in half and Sterling woke up alone in a forest that felt like the end of the world, all his negotiation skills turned to dust. The only skills that mattered now? Exactly the ones Jack used every single day just to survive until dawn. This story isn't about who has the most money or the most power. It's about what happens when all that is ripped away from you and you come face to face with the only thing that truly matters. Your ability to keep breathing when the whole world conspires to bring you down. Sterling will discover that survival has nothing to do with how much money you have in your bank account. And Jack? Well, Jack will prove that the man society threw away was worth more than any billion-dollar merger. Get ready, because this journey will show you that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't at the top of the skyscraper. It's under the bridge. Sterling Blackwood woke up at 4:47 a.m. as usual. Not because he had to. No one with $8.3 billion in the bank needs to wake up early. He woke because he could. Because while the rest of the world was still dreaming, he was already 3 steps ahead, closing deals with Tokyo, London, and Dubai. The penthouse at the top of the Millennium Tower overlooked all of Manhattan, the kind of view that costs more per month than most people earn in a year. He didn't even look out the window anymore. Why? When you own the world, the view gets kind of dull. Across town, under the Williamsburg Bridge, Jack Morrison also woke at 4:47 a.m., not by choice. The biting March cold in New York doesn't let anyone sleep well, especially when your blanket is a 15-year-old military sleeping bag and your pillow is a backpack filled with everything you own in the world. He opened his eyes slowly, checking his surroundings instinctively. Military training never leaves you, even when you're living under a bridge. 3 other homeless people slept nearby, wrapped in cardboard. Jack knew their names, their stories. On the streets, you learn that community isn't a luxury. It's survival. Sterling sipped his double espresso prepared by his private chef while reviewing financial reports on his iPad. 347 emails since last night. He smiled. Each email was an opportunity, a deal, another zero in the account. He put on his $7,000 Brioni suit, straightened his Hermes tie, checked the Patek Philippe on his wrist. Perfection. Total control. Meanwhile, Jack folded his sleeping bag with military precision, stowed it in his backpack, and began his morning walk to the 34th Street shelter, where they served coffee and bread and butter from 6 to 7 a.m. If you arrived after 6:30 a.m., you were done. It was all over. On the streets, timing isn't about closing deals. It's about eating or starving. Sterling got into the limo at 6:15 a.m. with 3 phones in hand and a $4.2 billion merger on his mind. Blackwood Capital was about to swallow the West Coast's largest tech company, and he had exactly 18 hours to close the deal before the Chinese came in with a counteroffer. He didn't even say hello to the driver. Why would he? The guy was paid to drive, not to talk. In the back seat, Sterling called Hong Kong, then San Francisco, then his lawyers in Chicago. His voice was cold, calculated, each word chosen like a chess piece. I don't care what they want. I care what they'll accept. Lower the offer by $200 million and tell them it's take it or leave it. The target company's CEO was desperate. Sterling could sense the desperation through the phone like a shark senses blood in the water. Sterling, be reasonable. My shareholders will never accept this. Sterling's laugh was short, almost cruel. Your shareholders will accept whatever you tell them to accept, Richard. Either you close with me today, or tomorrow I'll buy your debt and kick you out of your own company. Simple as that. Silence on the other end. Sterling already knew he had won. He always won. In the last 15 years, he had closed 47 mergers and acquisitions, each one bigger than the last. Losing? That was for ordinary people. At 7:30 a.m., as the limousine glided through Manhattan traffic toward Teterboro Airport, Sterling received the confirmation. The deal was done. Another $340 million in his pocket just from commissions and equity. He didn't even smile. It was just another day, another zero. He sent a 2-line email to the CFO. Done. Prepare the documents. I'll be in Chicago at 11 a.m. He put away his phone, picked up another, and checked the stock price. Everything was rising. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. He had no idea that in less than 3 hours, control would be a word that meant absolutely nothing. Jack had woken up screaming the night before, as he always did on Tuesdays and Thursdays. His brain had its own trauma calendar. In the dream, he was back in Kandahar, 2009, and Sergeant Martinez's Humvee was exploding again, and again, and again. He could feel the heat of the blast, the smell of burning flesh, the screams. He woke in a cold sweat under the bridge, his heart pounding like a machine gun, his hands shaking. The other homeless people didn't even wake up when he screamed anymore. Everyone there had their own demons, their own wars. Jack sat in the dark for 2 hours, waiting for the sun to rise, waiting for reality to replace the memory. The VA hospital had given him medication, Zoloft, Prazosin, 3 more he couldn't even remember the names of. Did they work? Sort of. The problem is, when you're homeless, maintaining a medication routine is like trying to build a sandcastle during a hurricane. He'd lost his medication 3 months ago when the police cleared the camp under the bridge and threw everything away. Since then, it's been just him and the ghosts. Jack learned to live with it. You don't survive 2 tours in Afghanistan without learning to live with things that should destroy you. But living with it isn't the same as overcoming it. It never is. He had a photo in his wallet, protected by plastic, already faded. His unit, 2008, before everything went to hell. 12 men smiling into the desert sun. Young, invincible, immortal. 4 didn't return. 3 returned in pieces. The other 5 returned with pieces missing inside. The kind no one sees but everyone carries. Jack stared at the photo as the sun began to rise over the East River. "One more day, boys," he whispered. "One more day." It was what he said every sunrise, a promise, a prayer, a challenge. Survival was the only mission left, and Jack Morrison never abandoned a mission. The Gulfstream G650 was waiting in the private hangar at Teterboro, polished like a $65 million jewel. Sterling climbed the stairs without looking at the pilot, without looking at the flight attendant, straight to the Italian leather seat that cost more than a car. Behind him came his 3 top executives, Jennifer from legal, Marcus from finance, and David from operations, all carrying laptops, all with that expression of someone who sleeps 4 hours a night and thinks it's a badge of honor. Sterling didn't even wait for everyone to sit down. "I want the contracts reviewed before landing. No mistakes, no excuses." They were already opening their laptops before he finished his sentence. Captain Robert Chen had 22 years of experience, 15,000 flight hours, and a bad feeling he couldn't explain. He checked the weather radar for the 3rd time. A massive cold front was moving in from Canada, meeting warm air from the Gulf, creating exactly the kind of instability that makes experienced pilots postpone flights. He left the cockpit and walked down to Sterling. "Mr. Blackwood, we have a severe storm window en route. I recommend delaying for 2 hours, letting the system pass." Sterling didn't look up from his tablet. "I recommend you do the job you're paid for. I need to be in Chicago by 11 SAS. Take off." Chen returned to the cockpit with a clenched jaw. 22 years of flying, and he still had to deal with billionaires who thought money controlled physics. He looked at his co-pilot, Jake Morrison. No relation to Jack, just another cruel twist of fate. Jake was new, only 2,000 hours, and still had that glint in his eye of someone who thinks flying is glamorous. "It's going to be a bumpy ride," Chen said, planning the route. "Keep your seatbelts fastened and pray this beauty can handle it." At 8:47, the Gulfstream accelerated down the runway, engines roaring, and lifted off straight into a sky already beginning to darken on the horizon. Sterling didn't even glance out the window. He was too busy adding more zeros to his fortune to realize he was flying straight to the end of everything he knew. Jack finished his watery coffee from the shelter and began his daily route. It wasn't vagrancy, it was military strategy applied to urban survival. First stop, the dumpster behind the Whole Foods in Union Square, where they threw away perfectly good food just because it was close to its expiration date. He knew the exact time. 9:15, right after the morning shift organized the inventory. He arrived at 9:10, waited on the corner as if he had all the time in the world. When the clerk tossed the bags and went back inside, Jack moved quickly and silently, grabbed what he needed, and left everything organized. Respect. Even on the street, you maintain respect. At 10 a.m., he was at the public library, using the bathroom to wash up in the sink, a cat bath, as they called it. Cold water, soap he kept in a plastic bag, paper towels. It wasn't the Ritz, but Jack learned in the Army that hygiene isn't a luxury, it's survival. Disease kills more soldiers than bullets, and more homeless people than the cold. He brushed his teeth, put on deodorant, and changed his shirt for a clean one he'd washed in the McDonald's sink 2 days earlier. In the mirror, a 38-year-old man who looked 50 stared back, graying at the temples, deep wrinkles around his eyes. But he still had that military bearing, back straight, shoulders back. You can take the man out of the Army, but you can't take the Army out of the man. The rest of the morning was spent mapping. Jack knew every corner, every alley, every spot the police didn't look, every spot where tourists left change. He didn't ask for money, foolish pride perhaps, but it was all he had left. Instead, he offered services, carrying groceries for the elderly for $2, helping tourists with directions, storing bicycles. He'd earned $8.50 by noon, enough for a sandwich and some to save for the winter that always returned more cruelly. As he walked down Fifth Avenue, he passed an Apple store, saw his reflection in the glass next to executives in $1,000 suits. Two worlds, same sidewalk. He kept going. Survival doesn't stop for self-pity. At 9:34 a.m., at 37,000 feet, the Gulfstream entered the edge of the storm front. The first turbulence was mild, just a jolt that made Sterling's coffee wobble in his cup. He didn't even notice. He was yelling on the phone to an Illinois senator about regulations that threatened to delay the merger. "I don't care what the committee says, Tom. You were elected to make things happen, not to create obstacles. Remember who funded your campaign?" In the cockpit, Captain Chen saw the wall of black clouds ahead and felt his stomach tighten. This was no ordinary storm. It was a living beast, swirling, growing, waiting. Jake, the co-pilot, checked his instruments for the fourth time in 5 minutes. "Captain, turbulence is increasing. Radar shows convective cells forming directly on our route." Chen was already adjusting altitude, trying to find calmer air. "Tower, this is Gulfstream November 73 Bravo Whiskey. Requesting a course change. Divert 40 degrees northeast to avoid a storm system." The reply came back filled with static. "Negative 73 Bravo Whiskey. Heavy traffic on this route. Maintain current course, cleared to climb to 41,000 feet. Chen swore under his breath. Climbing meant entering deeper into the storm, not avoiding it. But orders were orders. At 9:51 a.m., the sky turned the color of molten lead. Turbulence went from mild to moderate to severe in a matter of seconds. The plane shook violently, throwing Jennifer against her seatbelt with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. Marcus's laptop flew down the aisle. Sterling finally hung up the phone, irritated. "What the hell is going on?" He pressed the intercom button. "Chen, control this damn plane." In the cockpit, Chen didn't respond. He was too busy struggling with the controls as the $65 million Gulfstream was tossed through the sky like a dry leaf. Jake looked out the window and saw something that made his blood run cold. Lightning bolts, dozens of them, dancing through the clouds like electric snakes. And they were flying straight into it. Sterling unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, ignoring Jennifer's protests. "Stay seated." For God's sake, he didn't care. His whole life, rules were for other people. He swayed down the aisle, holding onto his seats to the cockpit door. He knocked loudly. "Chen, open this door, now." The captain pressed the intercom button without taking his hands off the controls. "Mr. Blackwood, go back to your seat and buckle up. This is non-negotiable." Sterling knocked again, harder. "Nothing is non-negotiable with me. I pay your salary. I own this plane. Open this door." The arrogance in his voice was so solid you could touch it. Chen finally unlocked the door, and Sterling burst into the cockpit like a human hurricane. "What part of I need to be in Chicago by 11 a.m.? Don't you understand? Dodge this storm, climb, descend. Do what you have to do, but get me on the ground in Chicago in 40 minutes. Chen didn't even look at him, his eyes fixed on the instruments, which were starting to give erratic readings. "With all due respect, sir, physics doesn't negotiate. We have 80-knot winds, severe shear, and icing on the wings. I need to divert to Cleveland or Detroit land and wait it out." Sterling let out a humorless laugh. "Are you telling me a $65 million plane can't handle a little wind?" Jake, the co-pilot, turned in his seat, his voice tense. "Mr. Blackwood, it's not a little wind. It's a supercell forming. I've seen storms like that take down planes bigger than ours." Sterling leaned forward, placing his hand on the back of Chen's chair, invading his space. "Do you know how many times I've heard 'can't do it' in my career? Thousands. And do you know how many times I've accepted that answer? 0. You were hired to fly this plane, not to be afraid of clouds. So fly." Chen clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. 22 years of experience, 15,000 hours, 3 safety decorations, and he still had to listen to a billionaire who didn't know the difference between altitude and attitude give orders on how to fly. He looked at the radar, then at the dark sky ahead, then back at Sterling, and made the decision that would change everything. "Yes, sir. Maintaining course." At 10:03, the first lightning bolt struck. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies. It was a blinding white flash and a sharp crack like a rifle shot. The entire plane shuddered, the lights flickered, and half the cockpit instruments went dark for 3 seconds before coming back on. Chen tasted metal in his mouth, pure adrenaline. "Shit. Jake, check the systems." The co-pilot was already flying through the emergency procedures, fingers dancing over the controls. "We've lost autopilot. Primary navigation offline. Switching to backup systems." Sterling was still in the cockpit, now gripping the back of his seat tightly, his face finally showing something beyond arrogance. Fear. Just a little, but it was there. The second bolt came 40 seconds later, and this one was worse. It struck the left wing, sped through the fuselage like an electric snake, and fried the secondary hydraulic system. Alarms began to blare. Beep, beep, beep. That sound every pilot learns to hate. Chen struggled with the controls, which suddenly felt heavy and resistant. "We've lost hydraulics in System B. Compensating with System A." His voice was calm, practiced, but Jake could see sweat trickling down his temple. In the passenger cabin, Jennifer was praying quietly. Marcus had his eyes closed, his hands white from gripping the armrests. David was vomiting into an air sickness bag. At 10:07, the weather radar went completely dark. The screen went black, then showed only green static. "No, no, no." Jake tapped the panel as if that would help. It didn't. They were flying blind now, 41,000 feet in the middle of a supercell, with no radar, systems failing one by one. Chen made the decision, declaring emergency. "Tower, this is November 7-3 Bravo Whiskey. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Multiple system failures, requesting emergency vector to nearest airport." Static. He tried again. More static. The radio had died too. Sterling finally understood. "Money can't buy you out of a storm at 41,000 feet, he whispered, so softly it was almost lost in the din of alarms. "Oh my God." Chen didn't look at him. "Now you pray. Go back to your seat and pray." Sterling staggered back into his seat, the plane shaking so violently that he slammed his shoulder into the aisle wall. Blood. He didn't even feel it. Jennifer pulled him into the seat next to her, buckling him in with trembling hands. "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay," she repeated like a mantra, but her eyes said something else. Marcus had stopped vomiting and now just stared straight ahead in shock. David was crying openly, calling his cell phone even though there was no signal, leaving voicemails for his wife she would never hear. I love you so much. Tell Tommy Daddy loves him." Her voice broke. In the cockpit, Chen managed one last radio transmission before it died. Static, then a moment of clarity. "Tower, whatever. Listening, November 7-3. Descent, controlled, losing. Altitude." He didn't even know if anyone had heard. The altimeter was spinning backward. 40,000 feet, 38,000, 35,000. They were falling, not free-falling, but descending too fast, and the controls were becoming less and less responsive. Jake was 28, married for 6 months, with a daughter on the way. He looked at the captain. Chen cut him off. "Focus, Jake. We're still flying. As long as we're flying, we have a chance." At 10:14 a.m., through a break in the clouds, Chen saw something that made his heart stop. Trees, thousands of them, stretching as far as the eye could see. The Allegheny National Forest, 5 and 13,000 acres of absolutely nothing. No runway, no road, nowhere to land a jet that needed at least 5,000 feet of runway. He pulled the controls with all his might. trying to gain altitude, but the plane was no longer responding. It was dying, systems failing one by one, taking them all with it. Chen looked at Jake one last time. "It was an honor to fly with you." Jake nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Likewise, Captain." In the passenger cabin, Sterling Blackwood, the man who had it all, held Jennifer's hand and, for the first time in 30 years, truly prayed. And then the trees filled the windshield. The Gulfstream hit the treetops at 180 knots, and the world exploded into twisted metal and splintered wood. The right wing ripped off first, spinning through the air like a giant leaf before disappearing into the forest. Then the tail split, taking David and Marcus with it in a second of pure horror. The rest of the fuselage ricocheted from tree to tree, each impact ripping out more pieces, more seats, more lives. Jennifer let out a scream that was cut short when an oak branch smashed through the window beside her. Sterling saw it all in slow motion, the roof ripping open, luggage flying, bodies being tossed around like rag dolls. Then her head hit something hard, and the world went black. Silence. Not the peaceful silence, but the heavy, wrong silence that comes after violence. Sterling woke up after he didn't know how long. It could have been minutes or hours. Everything hurt. He tried to move and screamed. Broken ribs for sure. Maybe 3, maybe more. Blood trickled from the cut on his forehead, seeping into his eyes, turning everything red. He blinked, trying to focus. He was hanging upside down, still strapped into his seatbelt. Jennifer's seat next to him was empty, the belt cut. Either she had gotten out, or he didn't want to consider the alternative. Sterling managed to unbuckle his belt with trembling fingers and fell 2 feet onto what remained of the plane's roof. Every movement was agony. He crawled across the twisted fuselage, calling out, "Jennifer? Chen? Anyone?" Silence. He found Jake first. The co-pilot was still strapped into his seat, but his empty eyes told the story. Sterling turned and vomited. He kept crawling, past wreckage, past things his brain refused to process. He found Chen unconscious but breathing, trapped in the wreckage. Sterling pulled, tried to free him, but the metal wouldn't budge. He pulled until his hands bled. It was no use. Chen opened his eyes for a second, focused on Sterling, whispered something that sounded like "go," and then his eyes closed again, forever. Sterling staggered out of the fuselage, fell to his knees in the wet dirt, and for the first time since he was 12, he cried. Sterling knelt there for how long, he didn't know. It could have been 10 minutes, it could have been an hour. Shock is a strange thing. It shields you from reality until you're ready to face it. But reality doesn't wait for you to be ready. It arrives anyway, cold and brutal. He looked around for the first real time. Trees. Trees everywhere. So dense the sky was barely visible. Pieces of the Gulfstream strewn across 200 yards. A wing here. Seats there. An open suitcase with expensive clothes scattered in the mud. His Brioni suit was torn, covered in blood and jet fuel. The Patek Philippe still showed 1047. He had stopped on impact, frozen in the moment. Everything changed. He tried his phone, the top-of-the-line iPhone 15 Pro Max. Useless. No signal. Of course, there was no signal. He was in the middle of nowhere, literally the middle of nowhere. Sterling spun 360 degrees, searching for what? A road? A house? A sign of civilization? Nothing. Just forest, dense and dark and endless. Panic began to rise in his throat like bile. He was Sterling Blackwood. He commanded boardrooms. He moved markets with a phone call. He had $8.3 billion, and none of that meant a damn thing here. He was alone, hurt, lost, and for the first time in his life completely out of control. The pain in his ribs throbbed with each breath. The cut on his forehead had stopped bleeding but throbbed. He checked the rest of his body. His left ankle was swollen, probably sprained. Cuts and scrapes everywhere. But he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. Sterling stared back at the twisted fuselage, thinking of the others. Jennifer, Chen, Jake, Marcus, Davy, all dead. Why had he survived? It didn't make sense. He was the one who had forced the flight, the one who had ignored the warnings, the one who had put everyone in danger, and he was the only one who had survived. The irony was so cruel it almost made him laugh. Almost. Instead, he turned and began walking, directionless, without a plan, just away from the bodies, the wreckage, the reality of what had happened. The forest swallowed him in seconds. The sun began to set at 6:30 p.m., and Sterling finally understood what true fear was. Not the fear of losing a trade or seeing stocks plummet, Primal, visceral fear, the kind humans felt when they still lived in caves. The shadows between the trees grew longer, darker, and sounds began to emerge. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something moving in the darkness he couldn't see. He had walked for hours without direction, and now he had no idea where he was. Worse, he had no idea where he had come from. The fuselage, the wreckage, everything had disappeared behind him into the identical forest. He was lost on a level his urban brain could barely process. When darkness fell, Sterling stopped walking because he couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the forest was a kind of darkness he'd never experienced. Utter darkness. Suffocating. Alive. He leaned against a tree, slowly climbed down until he sat on the wet ground and hugged his knees. The March cold in Pennsylvania is no joke. During the day it was about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but at night it dropped to 35, almost freezing. His torn suit offered no protection whatsoever. Within 20 minutes, he was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard he bit his tongue and tasted blood. Then the sounds really began. First, a distant howl. Coyote. Wolf. He didn't know. Then something larger moving through the bushes, too close. Sterling froze, holding his breath, every muscle tense. Heavy footsteps, deep breathing. Something large was perhaps 20 feet away. He could feel it. He could hear it. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure the creature could hear it too. Seconds dragged on like hours. Then, whatever it was moved away, the sounds fading into the forest. Sterling exhaled and realized he was crying again. Not from sadness this time, from pure animal terror. He had 9 more hours until dawn. 9 hours in this darkness, in this cold, with these sounds. He didn't know if he would survive until sunrise. And for the first time in his life, Sterling Blackwood understood that money can't buy sunrise. While Sterling was having the worst night of his life across the state, Jack Morrison was having a normal night, which for him meant sleeping with one eye open. He'd learned this in Afghanistan, where complete relaxation could mean waking up dead. Under the bridge, he woke at 2:30 a.m. when he heard footsteps. 2 guys, probably high on drugs, looking for someone to rob. Jack didn't move, didn't make a sound, just adjusted his hand position to get closer to the knife he kept hidden in his boot. The guys walked right past. Survival instinct isn't something you learn from a book, it's something you earn by bleeding. In the morning, Jack went through his routine with military precision. Wake up, check the perimeter, fold gear, plan the day. In the military, they called this mission prep. On the street, it was all about not dying. He had a mental map of the entire Manhattan, where to get food, where to get clean water, where the police wouldn't bother him, where the other homeless were safe, where they were dangerous. Every corner was mapped territory. Every alley had an escape route. You don't survive 2 years on the street without treating the city like a combat zone. Because that's exactly what it is. Jack passed the 42nd Street subway station and saw a young guy, maybe 20, sleeping against the wall with his backpack by his side. An amateur's mistake. Jack stopped, looked around, then nudged the boy with his boot. "Hey, wake up." The boy jumped, startled. Jack pointed to the backpack. "Sleep with this under your head, not next to it. Someone's going to steal it in 2 seconds." The boy looked at him with sunken, lost eyes. "Thanks, man." Jack was already walking away. He didn't have time for charity, but he also couldn't watch a soldier fall without at least trying to help. And everyone on the street was a soldier in some war. He kept going. Another day, another mission. Survive until sunset. Repeat tomorrow. Sterling woke up on the 3rd day, or he thought it was the 3rd day. He'd lost track, with his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. Thirsty. Not the kind you get when you forget to drink water at the gym. Real thirst. The kind that makes your body scream that it's dying. Because it was. Dehydration kills in 3 days, and he'd already been, how long? 2 days? 3? The Patek Philippe had stopped. His cell phone had died. The sun was moving across the sky, but he couldn't track it anymore. All he knew was that he needed water. Now, or he would die here, alone, and the vultures would eat the $8.3 billion man like they ate any other corpse. He heard water running. A stream. It had to be a stream. Sterling stumbled toward the sound, tripping over roots, tearing what was left of his suit on bushes. It took him 40 minutes to find it, but there it was. A small stream, brown water running over rocks. He dropped to his knees on the bank and buried his face in the water, drinking desperately. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. Better than $1,000 champagne. Better than anything. He drank until his stomach hurt, then drank more. He filled his hands and splashed water on his face, his neck feeling life return. 6 hours later, Sterling was vomiting so violently he thought he might spit out his own organs. Cramps tore at his stomach like knives. Explosive diarrhea that left him weak, shaking, covered in a cold sweat. The damn water was contaminated. Parasites, bacteria, God knows what. He had just hastened his own death by trying to avoid it. Sterling lay in the dirt, curled into a fetal position, moaning. Each wave of cramps was worse than the last. He thought of Jennifer, of Chen, of the others. He thought maybe it would have been better to die on impact, quickly, instead of this slow agony. He thought of everything he had built, all those zeros in his bank account, and how none of that mattered when you're dying of dysentery in a forest. When the cramps finally stopped, it was night again. Sterling had lost another day, and he had almost lost his life over a sip of dirty water. On the fourth day, or fifth, Sterling had completely lost count. He woke up drenched. It had rained during the night, that bone-piercing cold March rain. He had tried to take shelter under a large tree, but it was no use. Water ran down the branches, down the trunk, soaking everything. His clothes were wet, his skin was wet, and the cold was so intense he couldn't stop shivering. Hypothermia. The word popped into his head. He'd read about it somewhere, some Forbes article about executives who died in skiing accidents. You get confused, drowsy, stop shivering, and then you die. Sterling forced himself to get up. He needed shelter. He needed to dry off. He needed to stop being so utterly useless. He tried to build something. He wasn't sure what, but he'd seen it on a TV show once. Bear Grylls or some crazy guy like that. He grabbed branches and tried to prop them against a tree to make a sort of tent. The branches fell. He tried again. They fell again. He didn't know how to tie knots. Didn't know what kind of branches to use. Didn't know anything. 45 minutes later, all he had was a pathetic pile of twigs that crumbled every time he touched them. Sterling kicked the pile angrily, and the pain from his sprained ankle exploded up his leg. He screamed, fell, and pounded the ground with his fists. Why can't I do this? Why can't I do anything? The truth hit him like a slap. He had spent 30 years building an empire, but he didn't know how to construct a simple shelter. He knew how to close billion-dollar deals, but he couldn't tie a knot. He commanded thousands of employees, but he couldn't manage his own survival. All his education, Harvard Business School, an MBA with honors, 3 languages, was completely useless. He sat in the rain, letting the water run down his face. Mixing with tears he no longer tried to hide. Somewhere on the other side of the country, people were looking for him. Rescue teams, helicopters, maybe even the military. But the forest was vast, and he was small, and with each passing day, his chances diminished. Sterling looked at his hands, hands that signed contracts, that shook hands with presidents, that had never done anything truly useful, and he realized that maybe he didn't deserve to be rescued. 26 miles away, at Blackwood Capital's Manhattan office, chaos had begun 36 hours after the Gulfstream failed to land in Chicago. Sarah Chen, Captain Robert Chen's sister and the company's VP of Operations, was the first to sound the alarm. Sterling never ever missed a meeting. When he failed to show up and failed to answer 47 calls, she knew something was terribly wrong. At 2 p.m. on the first day, she called the FAA. By 3 p.m., the Coast Guard had been dispatched. By 4 p.m., the Gulfstream's last fragmented transmission had been located, somewhere over the Allegheny National Forest. 513,000 acres. 500,000 acres of dense, mountainous, virtually impenetrable forest. Air National Guard Lieutenant Marcus Webb looked at the map and swore under his breath. He had 15 years of search and rescue experience, and he knew exactly what that map meant. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Rhode Island, he told the team. And if there are survivors, they have maybe 72 hours before exposure kills them. They launched 3 Black Hawk helicopters on the second day, flying in a grid pattern over the forest. From the air, everything looked the same. Trees, trees, more trees. A white jet should have stood out, but the cloud cover was thick, and pieces of metal reflecting the sun could have been anything. After 8 hours, they had found nothing. On the third day, ground teams entered the forest. 40 men, sniffer dogs, state-of-the-art equipment. They covered 12 square miles in 14 hours. They found an abandoned campsite, 2 dead deer, and absolutely no sign of the Gulfstream. The forest had simply swallowed the plane as if it had never existed. Webb knew the statistics. After 72 hours, the survival rate in plane crashes drops to less than 5%. After a week, it drops to nearly 0. He didn't tell Sarah Chen this when she called for the 10th time that day, her voice breaking, begging for news. He simply said, "We're still looking, ma'am. We're not giving up." But deep down, he already knew. The forest rarely gave back what it took. By the 6th day, Sterling had begun marking the days by carving slits into a tree with a sharp stone. Hunger had become a living thing inside him. It was no longer just discomfort. It was physical pain, constant gnawing. His stomach had stopped growling on the 3rd day and now only hurt, a dull, deep ache. He had tried eating plants, leaves, roots, anything green. Some simply tasted bad. Others made him vomit again. One left his mouth numb for 3 hours, and he was certain he was going to die of poisoning. Sterling Blackwood, who had dined at 3 Michelin star restaurants, who had eaten 500-ounce caviar, was literally starving to death surrounded by food he couldn't identify. The weakness was worse than the hunger. His muscles had begun to consume themselves. Catabolism. The word came to mind from some 30-year-old biology class. The body eating its own muscle to survive. He could barely stand for more than a few minutes. Walking 100 yards left him breathless, his heart racing. The cut on his forehead had become infected. He could feel the heat, see the redness spreading. Fever. He alternated between violent chills and sweat that soaked his already filthy clothes. And then the hallucinations began. First was Jennifer. She appeared through the trees, dressed in white, smiling. "Sterling, this way. The exit is this way." He followed her for 20 minutes before realizing he was walking in circles. Then came his father, dead for 15 years, sitting in a chair that didn't exist, smoking a cigar. "You've always been weak, kid. Always knew you'd fail when it really mattered." Sterling yelled at the apparition, throwing rocks that went through the ghost and hit trees. Then came the worst, himself, a younger version, in an impeccable suit, laughing. "Look at you, the great Sterling Blackwood. $8 billion and you can't even stay alive for a week. Pathetic." Sterling fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the voice continued, because it was coming from inside his own head. He was losing his sanity along with his body, and part of him, a small but growing part, wanted to just lie down and let it all end. Sterling awoke on the 7th day to the sound of something large moving nearby, not the distant sound of the first night. This was close, very close. He opened his eyes slowly, every muscle tense despite the weakness. 30 feet away, rummaging through the remains of berries he'd tried to eat yesterday, was a bear, a black bear, perhaps 300 pounds, its dark fur glistening in the morning sun. Sterling stopped breathing. Every instinct screamed to run, but some fragment of knowledge, a TV show, an article, something, told him to stay put. Bears chase what runs. Bears kill what runs. The bear lifted its head, sniffed the air, and its small dark eyes focused directly on Sterling. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Man and animal stared at each other. Sterling could see every detail. The claws, long as fingers. The fangs as the bear opened its mouth. The muscles rippling beneath the skin. The bear took a step toward him, then another. Sterling did the only thing his brain could process. Stood, spread his arms to make himself appear larger, and screamed. Not words, just a primal animal scream of pure terror and desperation. The sound that came out of it hardly sounded human. The bear stopped, confused. It tilted its head. Sterling screamed again, flailing his arms, staggering forward on shaky legs. "Get out of here! Get out of here!" His voice was hoarse, broken, but there was something in it. Desperation, madness, the energy of a man with nothing left to lose. The bear took a step back, then another. It let out a snort, turned, and disappeared into the forest with surprising speed for something so large. Sterling stood still, arms still raised, for a full minute. Then his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the ground, shaking so violently, his teeth chattered. He had faced a bear. He had screamed at a 300-pound predator and lived to tell the tale. For the first time in 7 days, Sterling felt something other than despair. He felt a tiny, fragile flicker of something that might have been pride, or maybe just madness. At this point, it was hard to tell the difference. On the 8th night, Sterling sat with his back against a tree and finally let it all fall apart. Not gradually, not with dignity, all at once, like a dam breaking. He cried until he had no tears left, until his throat was raw, until his eyes burned. He cried for Jennifer, for Chen, for Jake, for everyone who had died because he had been too arrogant to listen. He cried for the wife who had divorced him 5 years ago because he loved money more than her. She cried for the 2 children she barely knew because she was always closing another deal, always chasing another zero. He cried for 30 years of a life built on sand. He thought of all the choices he'd made, every person he'd stepped on to get ahead, every employee he'd fired by email, every family he'd destroyed by closing companies for profit, every time he'd chosen money over humanity. "I'm a monster," he whispered to the darkness. "I've always been a monster." The forest didn't respond. It offered no absolution, no judgment, only silence. And somehow that was worse than any condemnation. He'd spent his entire life being important, being noticed, being feared. And here, nature didn't even care enough to judge him. He was irrelevant, always had been. Sterling looked at his hands in the dim moonlight. Hands that had once been manicured weekly were now dirty, cut, bleeding, broken nails, torn skin. The hands of a man who was slowly dying. He considered simply stopping trying, lying here and letting the forest take him as it had taken the others. It would be easy, it would be deserved. But then, from somewhere deep inside, maybe survival instinct, maybe stubbornness, maybe just fear of death, came a voice. Small, but clear. Not like this. You don't die like this. Not like a coward. Sterling couldn't tell if the voice was his or someone else's. It didn't matter. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath despite his broken ribs, and made a promise. If he survived, if, by some miracle, he made it out of these woods alive, it would be different. It would be better. It would be human. It was an easy promise to make when you were dying. The hard part would be keeping it if you lived. While Sterling wrestled with his demons 200 miles away, Jack Morrison was having his own moment of truth under the bridge. It was 3 a.m., and he'd woken up screaming again. The same nightmare, always the same. Kandahar, 2009. The routine patrol turned ambush. Sergeant Martinez's Humvee on fire. But this time, the dream continued beyond where it usually stopped. This time, Jack relived what came next. Him running straight into the fire, pulling Martinez out as ammunition exploded inside the vehicle, the skin on his own hands burning, the smell, God, the smell. But he didn't let go. He dragged Martinez 40 yards to cover as bullets whizzed around. He saved his life. Jack sat in the dark, a cold sweat pouring down his face, and looked at the scars on his hands. Second-degree burns that never quite healed. He'd received a Bronze Star for that. The medal was somewhere deep in his backpack, wrapped in an old cloth. I hadn't looked at it in months. What for? Medals don't pay rent. Heroism doesn't get you off the street. He'd saved 6 men in 2 tours, 6 lives that were still breathing because of him. And America had thanked him by giving him PTSD, nightmares, and a veteran system so broken he'd waited 8 months for a psychiatric appointment that never came. The irony was so bitter he almost laughed. But the thing about survival, real survival, not the kind Sterling was learning, but the kind Jack lived every day, is that you can't afford to be stuck in the past. Bitterness is a luxury. Anger is a luxury. When you wake up every day not knowing if you'll eat, you don't have the energy to waste on emotions. Jack tucked the memories back into the mental box where he kept all the things he couldn't change, got up, folded his sleeping bag, and began preparing for another day, another mission. The sun hadn't risen yet, but he was already planning his route, where to get coffee, where to avoid the police, where to maybe make a few bucks. Survival isn't an event, it's a process. And Jack Morrison was an expert at processes. He'd learned it in the wilderness. He'd honed it on the streets. And without knowing it, all those skills, every technique, every instinct, every blood-bought lesson, were about to mean something far greater than he could have imagined. Sterling woke up on the 9th day, and something had changed. Not externally. He was still dirty, hurt, hungry, lost. But internally, something had solidified overnight. The promise he'd made wasn't just the empty words of a desperate man. It was real. He would survive. Not because he deserved it, not because he was special, but because giving up was too easy. And Sterling Blackwood, for all his flaws, had never taken the easy path. He'd built an empire from scratch. He'd turned $50,000 in borrowed money into $8.3 billion. If he could do that, he could build a damn fire. He could find food. He could survive. He began to think like he thought in business, breaking the problem into smaller parts. Survival wasn't a vague goal. It was a series of specific tasks. Task 1, clean water. He had the stream, but he needed to boil the water. To boil, he needed fire. To fire, he needed what? He racked his brain for memory. Friction. He'd seen it on a TV show. 2 pieces of wood, friction, heat, fire. It sounded simple. It probably wasn't. But it was a plan. The first time in 9 days he'd had anything resembling a plan. Task 2, food. He didn't know which plants were safe, but he knew he'd seen fish in the stream. Small ones, but fish. He needed to catch one. How? A problem to solve later. One step at a time. Sterling stood. Movement still hurt. Everything hurt. But the pain was familiar now, and began searching for wood. Not just any wood, dry wood. He'd learned this the hard way, trying to make shelter from wet branches. It took him 2 hours, but he found a dead oak tree, dry branches still attached. He broke off 2 pieces, one harder, one softer. He sat on the ground and began scrubbing. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. His hands were raw. He kept going. 30 minutes, an hour. Smoke, tiny smoke, almost invisible, but it was there. Sterling laughed, a strange sound, half hysterical, but genuine. Come on, come on. He scrubbed faster, ignoring the pain. The smoke grew, and then, miracle of miracles, a tiny red live ember. He'd made a fire. Well, almost. Now he just needed to turn that ember into a flame. But for the first time in 9 days, Sterling Blackwood felt something he'd completely forgotten. Hope. Sterling cupped his hands around the ember as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And it was. That tiny ember was worth more than all his billions at that moment. He had prepared a nest of dry twigs and leaves. Instinct, trial and error, pure desperation. He blew gently on the ember. Too hard, and it would go out. Too soft, and it would die alone. He blew as if whispering secrets, delicate, controlled. The ember glowed brighter. Smoke rose. He placed it in the nest of twigs and blew again. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, like magic, a small flame licked at one twig, then another. Then the entire nest went up in flames. Sterling shouted in triumph, a primal sound that echoed through the forest. He fed the flame with larger twigs, then branches, building slowly, carefully. Within 20 minutes, he had a real fire. Small, but real, crackling, alive. He reached out to the heat and felt tears stream down his face again. But they weren't tears of despair this time. They were tears of relief so deep it hurt. Heat, for the first time in 9 days. Real heat. He sat too close, ignoring it as sparks burned holes in what was left of his shirt. The heat was worth any price. He fed the fire for hours, mesmerized by the flames, afraid to let it die, afraid that if it went out, he'd never be able to do it again. By nightfall, Sterling had a roaring fire and a plan. He dragged large rocks and made a circle around the fire. Containment, safety, control. He filled his water bottle, found in the wreckage days earlier, from the stream, and placed it near the embers. It wasn't boiling, but it was heat. It had to help. As he waited, he stared into the flames and thought of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. Now he understood why it was considered the greatest gift. Fire wasn't just heat, it was civilization. It was hope. It was the difference between human and animal. Sterling Blackwood, who had commanded meeting rooms and moved markets, was prouder of that pathetic fire than of any deal he had ever closed. Why this one? This one he had built with his own hands. This one had saved his life. And for the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would get out of here alive. On the 10th day, Sterling woke with a hunger so intense it hurt to think. The fire was still burning. He had fed all night, afraid of losing it, but fire didn't fill his stomach. He needed food, real food, or everything else wouldn't matter. He dragged himself to the stream, looked at the clear water rushing over rocks, and saw 3 small fish swimming upstream. Trout, maybe. He didn't know. It didn't matter. They were protein. They were survival. He just needed to catch one. With his bare hands? Impossible. They were too fast. He needed a tool. He needed to think. Sterling spent 2 hours sharpening a thick branch against a rock, turning the tip into a crude spear. His hands were bleeding again. The wounds had barely begun to heal. He ignored it. He returned to the stream, standing on the bank like a statue, spear raised. The fish returned, curious or stupid. He waited. Patience. For the first time in his life, Sterling Blackwood practiced real patience. Not the calculated patience of negotiations, but the primal patience of a predator waiting for prey. A fish passed close. He struck, missed. The spear hit the rock, the tip breaking. He cursed, went back, sharpened another spear. He tried again. It took 17 tries. 17. But on the 18th, the spear pierced the water and emerged with a 6-inch fish thrashing on the tip. Sterling screamed in victory so loudly it startled birds from the trees. He held the fish with trembling hands, barely believing it. Food. Real food. He ran back to the fire. Well, staggered, running was generous, and improvised a skewer from another branch. He placed the fish over the flames. The smell of roasting fish was the most incredible thing he had ever smelled. Better than French perfume. Better than new car leather. Better than anything. When the fish was ready, half burnt, half raw, perfect, Sterling ate it with his hands, tearing off chunks, swallowing, barely chewing. It tasted like victory. It tasted like life. And in that moment, with fish fat dripping down his chin and smoke in his eyes, Sterling Blackwood was the richest man in the world because he had something money couldn't buy. He had earned his own survival. On the 11th day, with fire and food sorted, Sterling returned to the wreckage for the first time since fleeing them. It took him 3 hours to find it. He'd walked further than he'd thought, and the whole forest looked the same. But eventually he recognized the clearing, the trail of destruction, the scattered pieces of metal. The bodies had. He didn't look. He couldn't. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. He needed something reflective, something large, something visible from the air. Because now that he'd decided to live, he needed to be found. And the only way to be found in a 500,000-acre forest was to make noise, or in this case, shed light. He found a large piece of the fuselage, polished aluminum, maybe 6 feet by 4. It weighed a ton, or at least felt like it when he tried to drag it. His broken ribs screamed in protest. He ignored it. He dragged the piece 20 feet, rested. Another 20 feet, rested. It took him 4 hours to move it 200 yards to a clearing where the sun was shining directly on it. He positioned the metal at an angle, reflecting light into the sky. During the day, any passing plane would see the reflection. At least that was the theory. He didn't know if planes were still searching. He didn't know if anyone still cared, but he had to try. Sterling spent the rest of the day improving the signal. He used rocks to spell out SOS in the dirt, each letter 10 feet high. He plucked green branches and piled them near the fire. If he heard a helicopter, he'd throw them into the fire to create white smoke, the universal distress signal. He worked until his hands bled, until he could no longer lift his arms, until every muscle screamed. And then he worked some more, because now he had a purpose. He was no longer just a lost man waiting to die. He was a man fighting to live. And Sterling Blackwood, for all his flaws, knew how to fight. He'd fought his entire life, but always for the wrong things. Money, power, ego. Now he was fighting for the only thing that truly mattered, and he wasn't going to give up. Not when he'd come this far. Not when he'd finally learned what it meant to truly win. On the 13th day, Sterling heard it. Distant, faint but unmistakable. The thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. He froze, thinking he was hallucinating again. But the sound grew louder. Real. He jumped, screamed, ran to the clearing. The helicopter was coming from the north, still far away, but getting closer. Sterling grabbed the green branches and threw them into the fire. White smoke burst into the sky. He waved his arms, screaming until his throat burst. "Here! I'm here! Please!" The helicopter got closer, closer. Sterling could see it now. Black Hawk, military markings. Search and rescue. They were searching. They were still searching. The helicopter passed directly over the clearing, perhaps 500 feet above. Sterling waved frantically, jumping, screaming, tears streaming. The reflection of the metal fuselage shone like a beacon. Smoke rose in a perfect white column. They had to see it. They had to see it. The helicopter continued straight ahead. It didn't slow. It didn't turn. It passed over him and continued south, the sound of the rotors fading. Sterling stood still, arms still raised, mouth still open in a silent scream. They hadn't seen it. They'd passed right over him and hadn't seen it. He fell to his knees, a sound coming from him that wasn't quite a cry, not quite a scream. It was something more primal, more broken. For 20 minutes, Sterling knelt there in the clearing, completely devastated. I had done everything right. He had built the signal. He had made smoke. He had waved. And it hadn't been enough. The forest was too big. He was too small. Even with helicopters searching, even doing everything he could, it wasn't enough. The despair returned, darker than before, because now I had tasted hope. And lost hope hurts more than never having hoped. But then, slowly, he stood. He wiped his face. He looked at the signal he had built. They hadn't seen it today, but they would come again. They had to come again. And when they did, he would be ready. He fed the fire, arranged more green branches, improved the SOS of rocks, because giving up wasn't an option. Not after he had come this far. Not after he had learned so much. He would survive, even if it killed him in the process. On the 14th day, the sky darkened, not gradually, suddenly, as if someone had turned off the light. Sterling looked up and felt his stomach tighten. Dark, low-hanging clouds were moving fast. The wind began to blow, cold and damp, carrying the scent of rain. A storm, another storm, like the one that had brought down the jet, as if nature were saying, "You thought you had won. Think again." He looked at the camp he had built, the fire, the crude shelter he had finally managed to make work, the metal sign placed in the clearing. The storm was going to destroy everything. It was going to put out the fire. It was going to scatter the rocks. It was going to blow the metal away. 2 weeks of work, destroyed in one night. The first drops fell at 3:30 p.m. Thick, cold, violent. Within 5 minutes, it was a deluge. Sterling ran to save the fire. He covered it with the piece of metal he'd used for the signal, creating a sort of tent. The rain pounded against the metal like drums. Wind howled through the trees, bending them, breaking branches that fell like missiles. One passed within 3 feet of him. Sterling huddled in the shelter, holding the metal to keep from flying, praying the structure would hold. Water began to pour in from all sides. Within 20 minutes, everything was soaked. The fire smoked, struggled, and died. Darkness, cold, again. The storm lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of wind that sounded like screams, rain that stung his skin, thunder so loud Sterling felt it in his chest. Lightning lit the forest in strobe-like flashes. Tree, stone, darkness, tree, stone, darkness. He lay huddled, shaking, soaked to the bone, watching everything he had built be destroyed. And the strangest thing happened. He began to laugh, not hysterics, genuine laughter, deep, almost joyful, because he understood something. The storm could destroy the camp. It could extinguish the fire. It could blow the signal away, but it couldn't destroy what he had learned. It couldn't erase the knowledge of how to make fire again. It couldn't take away the skills he had acquired. Sterling Blackwood had finally found something that couldn't be taken from him. And this, in the midst of the worst storm of his life, was almost funny. He had lost everything to learn that the only thing that mattered was what he carried inside. The irony was so perfect he laughed until it hurt. When the storm passed and the sun rose on the 15th day, Sterling emerged from the destroyed shelter and assessed the damage. The metal signal had flown 50 yards, stuck in a tree. The SOS stones were scattered. The fire was wet ashes. All was lost, except him. He was still standing, wounded, exhausted, shivering from the cold, but standing. And standing meant he could rebuild. He started immediately, not because he wanted to, but because stopping meant dying. He gathered dry twigs from under fallen trees where the rain hadn't reached. He rubbed them again. It took an hour, but he got embers. You got smoke, you got fire. The second time was faster than the first. He was learning. He was evolving. At 10 round, he heard it again. Rotors. More distant this time, coming from the east. Sterling dropped everything and ran to the clearing. Well, ran toward it, which was more of a limping jog. The metal of the signal was still stuck in the tree, too high to reach. He looked at the tree, at the sky, then back at the tree. The helicopter was getting higher. He had maybe 2 minutes before it would pass. The tree was 30 feet to the first branch. He hadn't climbed a tree since he was 8. His ribs were still broken. His ankle was still sprained. It didn't matter. He started climbing. Every movement was agony. Bark ripped at his already raw hands. Ribs screamed with every breath, but he climbed, branch by branch, foot by foot. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, louder. He reached for the metal, pulled hard, freed himself from the tree. He nearly fell in the process. He held on with one hand, legs dangling in the air. He pulled himself back up, climbed down 3 branches holding the metal, then simply jumped the last 15 feet. He landed hard. Something cracked in his knee. Pain exploded. He ignored it. He ran to the clearing, positioned the metal. The sun beat down and reflected into the sky like a beacon. The helicopter appeared over the trees. Sterling waved, shouted, prayed. The helicopter continued. It passed. It disappeared. Again. Sterling fell to the ground, laughing and crying at the same time, because he had climbed a tree with broken ribs. He had jumped 15 feet and kept running. He had done things that 2 weeks ago he would have sworn were impossible. They hadn't seen it, but he had won anyway. He had won himself, and that, he realized, was the only victory that truly mattered. By the 17th day, Sterling had stopped counting, not because he'd given up, but because the days no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was surviving until the next one. He had established a routine. Wake up, make a fire, fish, improve signal, sleep, repeat. He was thinner, probably having lost 40 pounds. Stronger, too, in a strange way. Not gym strong, but survival strong. His muscles had learned to do more with less. His body had adapted. He was a different version of himself. Tougher, more real, more human, ironically. He was checking the fish traps he'd learned to make when he heard it. Again, rotors. This time he didn't run. He walked purposefully to the clearing, picked up the green branches, and threw them into the fire. White smoke rose. He stood in the center of the clearing, arms raised, calm. If they saw him, they saw him. If they didn't, he would keep going. It was that simple. The helicopter appeared from the west, a Black Hawk, flying low. It passed over the clearing. It kept going. Sterling lowered his arms, ready to get back to work. Then the helicopter stopped, turned, returned. It hovered over the clearing, its rotors creating a hurricane of wind and leaves. Sterling looked up, shielding his eyes. A figure at the side door waved. They had seen it. After 17 days, they had seen it. The helicopter couldn't land. The trees were too dense. A stretcher with a cable was lowered. Sterling held it with trembling hands, lay down, and fastened the straps. The cable began to rise. He looked down as he ascended, the clearing growing smaller, the fire still burning, the metal signal glowing. His home for 17 days, his hell, his salvation. Hands pulled him into the helicopter. A paramedic, young, wide-eyed. "Sir, are you Sterling Blackwood?" Sterling tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. He only nodded. The paramedic spoke into the radio. "Confirmed. We have the survivor." "Repeat. We have the survivor." "Survivor. Singular." Sterling closed his eyes. Jennifer, Chen, Jake, Marcus, David, all dead. Only he had survived. Guilt crashed like a wave, but along with the guilt came something else. Gratitude, grief, relief, transformation. He had entered those woods as one person and was leaving as another. The helicopter turned toward civilization, and Sterling Blackwood, for the first time in 17 days, let himself cry without shame. Sterling woke up at Allegheny General Hospital 14 hours later, hooked up to a dozen tubes and machines that beeped constantly. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, 3 broken ribs, a fractured ankle, generalized infection, mild hypothermia. The list went on. The doctor, Dr. Sarah Patel, her name tag said, looked at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Mr. Blackwood, frankly, it's a miracle you're alive. 17 days alone in those conditions. Most people wouldn't last a week." Sterling looked at his hand, clean now, white bandages covering the cuts, an IV inserted in the vein. It felt like someone else's hand. It felt civilized. He almost missed the dirty, calloused hands that had made fire and fished and built shelter. Sarah Chen entered the room at 2 p.m., eyes red from crying. She had lost her brother, Captain Robert Chen. Sterling saw her, and something broke inside him. "Sarah, it was my fault. I forced the flight. Your brother wanted to divert, and His voice trailed off. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she came over and sat in the chair beside the bed. "I know," she said quietly. The black box was recovered yesterday. I heard the recording. I heard you ordering my brother to continue. Sterling expected anger, accusation, hatred. He deserved all of it. But Sarah only looked at him with tired, sad eyes. Robert made a choice. He was the captain. He could have refused, but he didn't, and now he's gone. The silence between them was heavy with everything that couldn't be said. Finally, Sarah spoke again. The others, Jennifer, Jake, Marcus, David, the families want answers. They want to know why. She stopped, wiped her eyes. They want someone to pay. Sterling nodded slowly. I'll talk to all of them. I don't know what I'll do, but I'll do something. It has to mean something. They can't have died for nothing. Sarah studied him for a long moment. You look different, she said finally. Not just physically. Something has changed. Sterling looked out the hospital window, at the blue sky, the white clouds, the world he had almost lost. I've changed, he said simply. I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if anything can be enough, but I've changed. Sarah nodded, stood, and walked to the door. She stopped, looked back. I hope so, Mr. Blackwood. For their sake, I hope so. And then she left, leaving Sterling alone with his thoughts, his guilt, and the question that would define the rest of his life. What do you do when you get a second chance you don't deserve? Sterling was released from the hospital 3 weeks later. The media was waiting. Cameras, reporters, microphones shoved in his face. Mr. Blackwood, how are you feeling? What happened in the forest? Is it true you forced the pilot to fly into the storm? He didn't answer any questions. He just walked straight to his car, ignoring the screams. He had more important things to do. The first was to visit their families. All of them. Jennifer left behind a husband and 2 children. Jake left behind a pregnant wife. Marcus had elderly parents. David had a wife and a 7-year-old son. Chen had Sarah and an 80-year-old mother. Sterling went to each house, sat in each room, looked into each pair of pained eyes, and told the truth. It was my fault. I forced the flight. I killed them. Some screamed. Some cried. One, Jennifer's husband, punched him. Sterling let him. He deserved worse. The second thing was money. He couldn't bring anyone back, but he could ensure families never had to worry about bills. He set up trust funds, $10 million for each family, education funds for the children, lifetime pensions. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. The third thing was harder. He sold Blackwood Capital, all of it, $8 billion in assets, sold in 6 months. The business media went crazy. Blackwood has a nervous breakdown. Billionaire quits after accident. He didn't care. He took the money, after taxes about $4.2 billion, and created a foundation, the Chen Morrison Foundation, half dedicated to homeless veterans, half dedicated to aviation safety and pilot training. And then, on a rainy Tuesday in October, Sterling Blackwood returned to New York with a purpose. He walked the streets he'd ignored for 30 years, searching. It took him 3 days, but he finally found him. Under the Williamsburg Bridge, a 38-year-old man who looked 50, graying hair, a military posture, sleeping in a worn sleeping bag. Sterling stood still for a long moment, just watching. This man, this homeless veteran he'd never met, who hadn't known existed, had saved his life. Not directly, but the skills Jack Morrison used every day to survive were the same ones Sterling had learned in the woods. Survival wasn't about money, it was about resilience, adaptation, refusing to give up. Jack had that, and unknowingly, he'd taught Sterling. Sterling approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Excuse me," he said softly. Jack woke instantly, eyes alert, body tense. Military training. "I don't want any trouble," Sterling said, hands raised. "I just want to talk. My name is Sterling, and I think you might have saved my life." Jack studied him with eyes that had seen too much. "I don't know you, man." Sterling smiled, a real smile, not the business smile he'd worn for 30 years. "I know, but I'd like to meet you, if you'll give me a chance." And there, under that bridge, between 2 men from completely different worlds, something began. Not redemption. Redemption was too complicated, too expensive, but maybe something better. Connection, humanity, the understanding that in the end, we're all just trying to survive until dawn. And sometimes the greatest wealth isn't what you have, it's who you become when you lose it all. So here's the truth that it took Sterling Blackwood 17 days dying in a forest to learn. You don't discover who you truly are when you have everything. You discover it when you lose it all. When the zeros in your bank account mean nothing. When your $7,000 suit is ripped and covered in blood. When the only thing standing between you and death is your refusal to give up. Sterling entered that forest a billionaire. He came out a human being. And the brutal irony? It took him losing $8 billion to finally understand what was truly worth something. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. What are you building? Are you building a life that looks impressive on the outside but is empty on the inside? Are you chasing zeros that will never satisfy you? Or are you building something real? Real connections, real purpose, real impact. Because the truth is, we will all face our own forest eventually. Maybe it won't be literal. Maybe it will be illness, loss, failure, tragedy. But it will come. And when it does, who will you be? Will you be Sterling on day one, completely lost because you never learned anything that truly matters? Or will you be Sterling on day 17, someone who has learned that survival isn't about what you have, but about who you are? Jack Morrison spent years being invisible. Society looked at him and saw failure, saw problems, saw something to ignore. But that worthless man had more survival skills, more resilience, more real strength than the billionaire in the penthouse. And when Sterling finally understood this, when he finally saw Jack as a human being instead of a statistic, everything changed. So here's my challenge to you. Look around. Who are you ignoring? Who are you judging? Who have you decided isn't worth your time? Because maybe, just maybe, these people have something to teach you that you desperately need to learn. Maybe the person you think has nothing is exactly the one who will show you what truly matters. If this story touched you, if it made you think differently about success, about value, about what really matters in life, then do something with it. Don't just like it and forget about it. Change something. Help someone society has forgotten. Question what you're chasing. Build something that will matter when you lose everything else. And if you want more stories that challenge how you see the world, that make you feel something real, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because we have more stories to tell. Stories about real people facing real things. Stories that remind you that in the end, it doesn't matter how much money you have. It matters who you are when no one is looking. It matters whether you get up when you fall. It matters whether you learn when life teaches you. Sterling learned. Jack always knew. And now you know too. The question is, what will you do with this?